Hello, I'm Sheridan Winn, author of the Sprite Sisters stories. I'm going to read a bit for you today from The Magic Unfolds, the second book. It's the bit when we have a strange visitor arriving at Sprite Towers. Chapter 4, Mrs. Duggery arrives. Mum had just finished giving a piano lesson at Sprite Towers on Thursday morning when the doorbell rang. She lifted up the heavy iron latch and opened the front door. Outside stood a tiny, very, very old lady with piercing eyes, a lilac knitted hat and big brown boots. "Good morning," said Mum brightly. "Morning," replied the old lady, in her broad Norfolk accent, staring Mum hard in the eye. Mum's mouth opened slightly in surprise. "I'm Mrs. Duggery, and I understand you want some help," said the tiny old lady. "Help? In the house?" "Oh, I don't think so," Mum smiled politely. "I heard you needed help, so I come," said Mrs. Duggery with absolute certainty. "Oh," Mum was taken aback. "Who would have told you that?" "As soon as I heard I come, so I's here," Mrs. Duggery repeated. She crossed her tiny arms over her tiny chest. "But we don't need any help," said Mum. "Well, I wouldn't have come if you didn't," said Mrs. Duggery, her eyes glinting. She stood square to the door, as if she was not going to budge. Well, hold on a moment, please," said Mum. "I'll just see if my mother-in-law knows anything about this." She closed the door slightly and went through to the kitchen. Grandma was sitting at the big oak table doing her newspaper Sudoku puzzle, but the sausage dog lay curled up by her feet. "Marilyn, have you said anything to anyone in the village about needing some help in the house?" said Mum, coming into the kitchen. "No, dear, why?" replied Grandma, looking up. "There's a strange old lady standing at the front door. Insists she's heard we need some help, and that she's come," said Mum. "Says her name is Mrs. Duggery." "Mrs. Duggery?" Grandma put down her newspaper and pencil. Then she said, "Good Lord, Mrs. Duggery! I haven't heard that name in years." "Who is she?" asked Mum, mystified. "She was our housekeeper when we were first married," said Grandma, standing up. "She looked after Colin when he was a baby." She chuckled. "She was an old lady then." "Well, goodness knows what that makes her now," said Mum, following her through the hallway to the front door. Grandma opened the door wide and stepped out. The old lady gave a beaming smile and opened her arms wide. "Well, bless me, that's Mrs. Sprite," she said. "Well, I never! Mrs. Duggery!" Grandma bent down, wrapped her arms around the old lady and gave her a big hug. Mum looked on, much amused at this reunion. "You must be the new Mrs. Sprite," said Mrs. Duggery, turning to Mum and holding out a tiny, very wrinkled hand. "Yes," smiled Mum and shook it. "Please come in, Mrs. Duggery. I'll make some coffee." "Thank you, that I will," said Mrs. Duggery, and she clumped through the front door. She stood for a moment in the hallway of the big old house and looked around and up the stairs. "Ah," she said, "that's nice to be back, that is." Grandma watched her smiling. Mum looked on, bemused. "I see you still got Master there," said Mrs. Duggery, pointing to Sydney Sprite's portrait on the wall. "He's watching over the old house, to be sure." "I'm sure he is," agreed Grandma. "Come on through." They walked through the library to the conservatory, Grandma tall and elegant, with her long dancer's strides, and Mrs. Duggery clumping along in her heavy brown boots. In the conservatory, Grandma opened the doors that led out to the garden, and they sat down in the big wicker chairs. In the kitchen, Mum filled up the kettle and put it on the agar hob. 5 minutes later, she carried a tray of coffee and chocolate biscuits through to the conservatory. Grandma and Mrs. Duggery were rattling on like old friends. Despite the warmth of the room, Mum noticed that Mrs. Duggery kept on her lilac knitted hat and seemed to be wearing a large number of cardigans. "Mrs. Duggery's offered to come and help with the housework," said Grandma as Mum sat down. "We could do with a hand for a bit, don't you think, dear? There are those big old cupboards in the attics that we've been meaning to turn out for months, but haven't found the time." Mum held her cup of coffee and sat silent and amazed. How could Mrs. Duggery possibly do housework, she wondered. She didn't look as if she was big enough to pick up a fly swatter, let alone turn out cupboards full of old furniture. "I'll settle up with Mrs. Duggery, so don't worry about that," continued Grandma. "She's very kindly offered to stay at Sprite Towers while we go away this weekend, so we don't need to worry about the animals." It was no good, Mum realised. She would have to agree to this. Objecting to Mrs. Duggery's help would offend her mother-in-law. "OK, thank you," said Mum. She smiled at Mrs. Duggery, who nodded and took a large bite out of her third chocolate biscuit. "That's all settled then," she said. Mum thought the old lady seemed to smile, but it was difficult to work out what she was thinking. Her face had so many lines in it, and her expression was so inscrutable. "Where do you live, Mrs. Duggery?" she asked. "Roundabout," replied the tiny old lady, swigging a large mouthful of coffee and taking a fourth biscuit. "Oh," said Mum, baffled. She looked at her mother-in-law for clarification, but Grandma just smiled at her as if this was all perfectly normal. "How did you get here?" asked Mum. "On me bicycle," replied Mrs. Duggery, dunking what was left of the fourth biscuit. "Oh," said Mum, "and have you any family, Mrs. Duggery?" Mrs. Duggery nodded and took her fifth biscuit. "Mrs. Duggery is a Sprite, Ottilie," said Grandma. "A Sprite?" said Mum. "That I am. My mother Eliza was Sidney Sprite's younger sister," said Mrs. Duggery. Then she stood up. "Right, thank you for the coffee and biscuits. Now he's brought me apron. Where would you like me to start?" Mum looked at Grandma in astonishment. Grandma jumped up and smiled at Mum. "I'll come with you, Mrs. Duggery," she said, and the two Sprites walked out of the conservatory. Mum sat in her wicker chair for a while, looking out at the garden and pondering how life at Sprite Towers was full of surprises. The Sprites are a strange lot, she thought. "We've got a new addition to Sprite Towers," Mum said, smiling rather mysteriously as she drove the girls home from school. "What? Who?" they all asked at once. "A lady called Mrs. Duggery," said Mum. "She's come to help Grandma sort out the attic cupboards. She's very old. In fact, your grandmother says she looked after your father when he was a baby. And she's a Sprite." Ariel smiled and looked out of the window as the car pulled through the gates of Sprite Towers. "What's she like?" asked Ash. "You'll soon see," said Mum, smiling. "She is unusual, and she's very fond of chocolate biscuits." The four Sprite sisters piled out of the car and in through the front door, their faces bright and eager. Mrs. Duggery seemed to know they were coming, as she was standing, waiting in the hallway. Flame, Marina and Ash stopped and stared. Ariel, however, walked forward, offered her hand and smiled at Mrs. Duggery. The tiny old lady took her hand and shook it. "Sidney told me you were coming," said Ariel. Mrs. Duggery said nothing. She simply nodded and gave Ariel an inscrutable smile. Flame, Marina and Ash looked at each other, then at their sister. "What is Ariel talking about?" wondered Mum. "She says some very strange things." The three older sisters shook hands with Mrs. Duggery. They gazed at her lilac knitted hat and looked down at her large brown boots. Then the tiny old lady turned and said, "Right, well, I'm off now," and clumped towards the open front door. "Your mother-in-law and I have made a start on the cupboards," she said to Mum. "See you tomorrow then." "Oh, right, thank you, Mrs. Duggery," said Mum, standing aside. "See you tomorrow." They all watched as the tiny old lady picked up a heavy old bone shaker of a bicycle which had been lying against the front wall. They stared, amazed, as she climbed onto it and cycled off, her tiny legs going like pistons, up and down on the pedals. As Mrs. Duggery set off down the middle of the long drive, Dad roared up the drive in his old sports car, saw her approaching, swerved, and narrowly missed hitting her. Mum and the four Sprite sisters gasped in horror, but Mrs. Duggery carried on as if nothing had happened. Dad scrunched to a stop in front of the house, got out of his car and shouted, "There's a mad old woman in a strange hat cycling down our drive. I nearly killed her." "That's our new addition to the household," said Mum, laughing. "Come on, let's have a cup of tea and I'll explain." As the Sprite family walked through the house, Flame stood at the front door, watching the tiny figure of Mrs. Duggery recede down the long drive. "She's come to protect Sprite Towers," she thought, "which means that something is about to happen."